Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 26th of August 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comment. Coming up in the show, can we expect next-gen console games to run at 60 frames per second? Dead Rising 3 will not be coming to other platforms, and the Deep Silver CEO comments on the future of the Metro franchise. All this in the OC Remix track of the day is coming your way right about now. It's been something of a mystery as to whether or not we can be expecting 1080p 60 FPS gaming from the latest in the console market, with the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 bearing down on us towards the end of this year. We still don't quite know what these things are actually capable of. The games we've seen so far have been demonstrated in a dev environment, and many of them have indeed been played on PCs at game shows as opposed to the actual hardware. So the question is, how much of an advancement will this console generation really be? Well, we've got a couple of answers on that one, particularly from the developers of Titanfall, that being Respawn Entertainment. In an interview with Eurogamer, they discussed the frame rate and the actual resolution of the game, but they weren't really confirming 1080p 60 at any point. They did, however, confirm that frame rate was king, so that's something that really we've heard from Respawn an awful lot. So they are targeting 60, but on the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, they did not say that they were targeting 1080p. In fact, when questioned about the Source engine, which is in fact what they're using right now, they commented that the Source engine was actually a pretty slow engine for showing stuff on screen. However, when they picked it up 2 years ago, they chose it because they knew they would have 2 years to spend to actually make it faster. They commented that originally, when it was used for Portal 2, it was DirectX 9 single-threaded and couldn't actually render that much on screen whatsoever. When the interviewer elected to just flat out ask them, will it run at 60 frames per second, Drew McCoy replied, "We're not talking about it. I'll say that the guys who are doing it are really smart and they're doing a good job, blah, blah, blah." So, yes, they're dodging that particular issue. And this would, of course, not be the only time that we have heard about frame rate on these particular machines. DICE has confirmed multiple times that Battlefield 4 on next-generation machines will be running at 60 frames per second. However, we don't really know what resolution that's going to be at, unfortunately. There was a tweet put out earlier in the week that suggested it would be running at 720p 60 frames per second on the PlayStation 4. However, it was later clarified that it was not running at 1080p in the dev environment, but it wasn't running at 720p either. One of the big misconceptions, of course, being that all games on console either run at 720p or 1080p and there is actually no middle ground, whereas in reality, an awful lot of games run at different resolutions. They simply upscale them to 1080p when required, or indeed downscale when appropriate. So, in fact, there are a lot more than two resolutions that you can run games at on consoles. The final resolution for Battlefield 4 on PlayStation 4 has yet to be confirmed at the moment, so we just flat out do not know. The concern, I suppose, is that the big two leaps that people were looking for were native 1080p, as in not upscaling, and 60 frames per second. Yeah, that would be a big difference for what we currently have. Right now, on current-gen consoles, unless you're something special, like, say, Metal Gear Rising, you are running at 720p, you may even be running lower resolution than that and upscaling to 720p, and then you're running at 30 FPS, and more often than not these days, we are seeing games drop below 30. That is happening an awful lot, because, hey, we're running on really old hardware now. It has gotten to that point. So, that gigantic leap was kind of to be expected, and honestly, if you can get 1080p 60 FPS experience on one of these next-gen consoles, it's really hard to turn around and say to someone, you know what's worth getting? A PC. It's a little bit tricky to argue that, because, hey, a lot of us enjoy the 1080p 60 FPS experience. Yes, there are higher resolutions available on higher resolution monitors, but the majority of people have 1080p capable displays, not 2560 by 1600 or indeed an iFinity setup. Indeed, according to the last Steam hardware survey, the number of people running 2560 by 1600 is in fact only 0.17%. Those running the 16:9 version of that higher resolution, that being 2560 by 1440, sitting at a fairly dismal 0.98%. I honestly feel that if you can't attain 60, then you're probably failing. I really, really do. It definitely decreases the likelihood of me wanting to play games on a next-gen machine if they can't make that happen. The smoothness now I feel is more important than that graphical fidelity. I really, really do. I still believe in that graphical diminishing returns idea that the closer you get to super realistic, the more technology you have to put into it in order for people to really see an appreciable difference. And yeah, someone like a hardcore gamer could look at the next gen stuff and say, yeah, there's clearly a difference here, but your average casual gamer, perhaps not. The differences between the platforms are starting to close from a visual appreciation standpoint. So if you don't have that smoothness, which as far as I'm concerned is noticeable in every possible instance, and I really do think that people that can't notice the difference between 30 and 60 are just incredibly inexperienced, then I would say that shooting for the 1080p 30 experience as opposed to the 720p 60 is kind of silly. It would kind of suck if you had to even make that choice. Eventually, I suppose you will have to, but I have to wonder how much optimization they can really squeeze out of these machines. We have seen massive improvements versus, say, launch title 360 games versus stuff that's coming out now. The difference is mind-boggling. Look at something like Perfect Dark Zero versus Halo 4 or even Black Ops 2. The difference is huge, and yet it's running on the same platform. So I do hope that they're shooting for 1080p 60. That does seem to be the target right now. I just have to wonder how many games will actually hit it and whether or not we will see games later on hitting that mark where the launch titles end up missing it in the first place. Rumors and perhaps wishful thinking has been circulating the internet as of late about Dead Rising 3, speculating that perhaps it is a timed exclusive for the Xbox One and will not, in fact, remain only on the system, as opposed to being ported to PlayStation 4 and PC. However, at Gamescom, Capcom has confirmed that Xbox One will be the only platform for Dead Rising 3, saying it's definitely not a timed exclusive, it is an Xbox One game. We see a lot of this online. It is not coming to PlayStation 4, it is not coming to PC. Gamescom also brought us a complete launch lineup, that being launch day as opposed to launch window, the first 3 or 4 months of the console's lifespan, for Xbox One, and it is looking a little bit stronger than what we saw previously. It does include Dead Rising 3, which is considered by many to be one of the killer apps. It also includes Crimson Dragon, which is a new game from one of the makers of Panzer Dragoon, something that did not get a warm reception at the Xbox One game's unveiling, mostly because they completely screwed up the actual presentation itself. Other exclusives include Rise Son of Rome, as well as Killer Instinct, Forza Motorsport 5, and Lococycle. If I am entirely frank, the launch lineup for both of the next-gen machines does not look that great at the moment. There's a couple of games that, if they'd actually hit launch, would have been those killer apps which would have really carried that launch lineup to the next level. As it stands, though, stuff like Infamous for the PlayStation 4 or Titanfall for the Xbox One will be launch window games. They will not, in fact, be shipping with the system. So it's kind of a lame boxing match, really, between the two of them. And frankly, I think it really comes down to which just happens to have the stronger brand value going into the launch period, which is expected to be November for both systems at this time. It may very well be that timed exclusives or exclusive content for multi-platform games will make the difference between the two systems when consumers are choosing which one to buy. Microsoft pulled out a fairly potent gambit in the form of a free copy of FIFA 14 for European customers upon launch of the Xbox One, and that was announced at Gamescom. This could potentially be what it needs to really push that console over the edge in Europe, a place where PlayStation and the Sony brand has traditionally been very dominant, as opposed to the US, where the Xbox edged out the PlayStation 3 in terms of sales. Pre-orders for the PlayStation 4 in the European region have been particularly strong, and it's also been announced that it will be launched in significantly more regions as opposed to the Xbox One, that has been severely limited in that respect during its launch window. One, of course, could also argue that the free copy of FIFA 14 with the pre-ordered Xbox One is something of a bandage to cover up the wound of the supposed features which will not be available in Europe on launch. The initial unveiling, of course, of the Xbox One focused heavily upon its interaction with media, which included an awful lot of US-specific sports coverage, which quite frankly is not all that relevant to the European market. It's been speculated that an awful lot of these launch features in the US will not have equivalents in the EU, at least not during the launch period. So that may very well make the Xbox One a less attractive proposition. Things are, however, heating up. There's no real question about that. Gamescom was a chance for both parties to lay some more cards down on the table and say, hey, this is what we've got. We're still, of course, looking for PAX Prime, although it's unlikely that anything major will be announced from either publisher at that event as opposed to Gamescom, which is a bigger and more prestigious event. It is possible that Tokyo Game Show will be the venue for yet another salvo from both parties, and that will probably be the last opportunity for either of those companies to really make a big announcement at a large third-party show. Deep Silver CEO Dr. Clemens Kondratitz confirmed that the Metro franchise would be continuing. It will absolutely continue, he said, and it was a positive experience for Deep Silver. However, some gamers, myself included, have been getting a little bit uppity in regards to a statement that he made during an interview with Joystick, where he said that the brand will also, in the next phase, look to make it more accessible for a broader gaming audience. The interviewer then questioned as to whether or not it would create problems for the fans and the license holder. However, his response didn't really address that concern, instead focused on the author of Metro 2033, Dmytro Klogovsky. This is potentially problematic. Now, when I tweeted about this a couple of days ago, I actually had a response from Hugh Bynon, who is the global brand manager for Deep Silver, saying that he thought I was smarter than that, also claiming that I may be guilty of misinterpreting a quote willfully or not, also, of course, conceding that I would not be the first or the last to do so. I then responded by saying that a quote is a quote, and when you're CEO of a company, you have to be careful with the words you use, especially accessible. Hugh replied that he could only agree with this. Let's pick up the thread in, say, a few years' time, and we'll see what actually transpired. Which is fair. You know, that's entirely fair, but I think you have to be extremely careful with using loaded terms like accessible. It is a dirty word in this particular industry. And when you use it in association with a series like Metro, which has been unafraid to take away convenience from you, has been unafraid to sink you into a very immersive and sometimes very challenging universe, that's been unafraid to limit stuff like ammunition, and even limit access to things like waypoints, HUD features, and all sorts of things like that. When it's been unafraid to really push the envelope when it comes to graphical fidelity, Metro Last Light being one of the best-looking titles I have ever seen on PC, you have to understand that people are going to get very, very worried when you throw around words like accessible. Quite recently, Kevin Spacey gave the McTaggart lecture for the opening of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and you might wonder, well, why is this relevant? It's an amazing lecture, and I would suggest that you all go watch it. It's available on YouTube. It's about 40 minutes long, and he talks about the future of media, and he talks about the creative and finding an audience for the creation. And he also talks about a bunch of stuff that applies to the television industry, but also applies to video games quite nicely. He talked about the idea of focus groups. He talked about the idea of a pilot system, which he said was broken. And more importantly, perhaps more so than anything else, he talked about allowing things to find an audience, not forcing an audience upon them, giving them the time, giving them the space to breathe and the support that they need in order to find an audience on their own. And he also said, look, this can take a while. It can take many seasons in order to really hit its stride. He talked about Seinfeld not reaching its full audience potential until season 4. Now, perhaps the most syndicated and most profitable show ever to exist on the planet. He talked about Breaking Bad not really finding its feet until it started to get put out on Netflix, when it really started to gather that audience. It had a very slow start indeed. And of course, we can apply it to older series like Firefly, which was canned very quickly and also was a victim of the American style of putting out series on cable. Also a victim of the pilot. It wasn't even displayed in the right order when it was first aired on Fox. This applies to video games. You have to allow the audience to grow for a title. And if Metro was profitable for you, the last thing you should be doing is dumbing that game down. Does accessible mean dumbing down? Not necessarily. Does it mean anything good, though? No, I don't believe so. We are talking about a game that's strongest aspect is its immersion through depriving you of otherwise very common elements. Yeah? The idea that you have to look at your watch for certain information. The idea that you have to count the bullets in your magazines. The idea that you have to manage your resources very carefully. The idea that, yes, you can die when you're outside if you do not find enough filters for your gas mask. The idea that your gas mask can be damaged. Your vision can be obscured. These are the strengths of Metro. The immersive nature and the atmosphere of that game can only be diminished by making it more accessible. It's not a complicated game. You can't argue that, that the game completely puts people off. No, I mean, the first hour, in fact, the first 2 hours of Metro Last Light handhold you completely. It's really annoying, actually. If I had just looked at the first 2 hours of that game before I had my impression of it, I'd probably have slammed it because, like, oh great, it's another Battlefield 3 campaign. It's another Call of Duty campaign where it opens doors for you and it holds your hand, and it takes a while to really get into the stride of things. You don't need to make that any more accessible. That is as accessible, annoyingly so, as it could possibly get. It's just a first-person shooter. The complexity does not come from elements that could be easily made more accessible without damaging the integrity of the creative product. That's the thing, yeah? You can't focus group test a game like that. What you need to look at is not the focus group testing, you need to look at the existing audience. Why are people playing Metro right now? Why is that happening? Will it continue to grow if you put out more, better Metro games while continuing to emphasize the strengths of the franchise? Probably, yes. I mean, we've seen growth from the first to the second game. We've seen marked improvement in many aspects of that particular title. Admittedly, it stumbled along the way in some places. The audience is very clearly there. The game has already found a significant audience within only 2 titles. Very impressive. Very impressive. And it did so on a fairly low budget. Frankly, I think there's a bunch of TV execs that would be killing for that kind of stuff. Wow, your game found an audience on that budget within only 2 titles. It didn't take 4 seasons to really get rolling. You didn't have to syndicate it to get it rolling. It's already successful. Build upon that. And then your audience will go out and tell other people. They will go and say, this series is amazing, you should play it. They will drive your franchise forward. And every time, as far as I'm concerned, every time we see a franchise like that taken to the more accessible level, it always suffers. Don't ruin a good thing. Don't interfere with the creative process of the developer. The publisher, in terms of video games, is very much like the network executive in terms of television. You can apply so many of those points that Mr. Spacey made to video games, and we should be paying attention because that guy knows what he's doing. Good lord. So I very much hope that he misspoke, and I hope that that doesn't mean what we think it means. But for the love of God, please be so careful with that word. Really. You want to tank the enthusiasm of the hardcore crowd, that word is a surefire way of doing it. Alright folks, that wraps me up for the content patch. Thank you very much for watching. I would like to remind you that I will be flying out to PAX later this week. As usual, this will mean that content patch takes a back seat, although we'll be running a couple of content paxes. I'll be doing some on-camera news about the particular event, and of course we will be running our co-optional podcast, currently known as the Game Station podcast on the schedule. We couldn't change it at that kind of notice. Live on Friday in the Serpent Theatre at 9 p.m. in the evening. So if you're coming to PAX, please do show up for that. All right. What are we doing for OC Remix, you might ask? Well, I've got a new one here from Darangen, and it is, in fact, a very recent release for Chrono Trigger. It's based on the songs Ocean Palace and Scala's theme, and it goes by the name of Devotio Aeternus. It's rather awesome, great use of guitar as well as keyboard in here. It sounds a little bit power metal-ish, actually. He described it as symphonic heavy metal. I would pretty much agree with him in that respect. It's very enjoyable. You can download it in the description below this video. I'll see you next time.